Right now in our application, we are at the place that we are able to display one state, normal here, or of course, if I were to change this to highlighted and let it recompile, this should get blue and move to the right, like this. But now we want to animate the transition between both states. Now, with that set back to normal, right now we have no way to move or change the state from our code. But we do have this animate button. And we try to execute the onAnimate method there. So let's hook up the onAnimate method here. onAnimate. And what do we want to do in this onAnimate method? I simply want to switch the state. So here I want to check if this state equals normal. Then I want to set this state equal to highlighted. Otherwise, I want to set this state to normal. Now with this in place, if I save this, let the application reload, now you see it's gone. Well, that's simply a bug because I'm using background color as a string and then like this here. We actually have to use the very same, and I think this should get fixed, to be honest. Just wanted to bring this to your awareness. If you're mixing the way you're setting up your properties, even though it should theoretically work, it doesn't. Make sure to use the same type of property name. But if I switch this and I now have the function to change my state, you can now see I can switch between both states and toggle between them. But now we want to animate the transition so that we not instantly switch the state, as we already are able to do with that, but now that we animate this. Otherwise we wouldn't need this animation trigger here at all, because just appending different styles, well, that's something we'll learn throughout the course. So in the next video, let's have a look at implementing this transition. So we're able to hard switch between states. Now let's animate it. In our animations trigger, on the same level as the state method, implement the transition method. This also needs to be imported from @AngularCore. Now transition is a very intuitive method. It allows us to describe how the transition from one state to another state should look like or should work, how it should be animated. Therefore, transition as a first argument expects the starting state, then an arrow pointing or indicating the direction, and then highlighted here. So this means from normal to highlighted. Well, now in the second argument, we specify what to do. We specify animate, which also needs to be imported from @AngularCore. So now for this direction, from normal to highlighted, we now set up how to animate this. And the easiest way is to simply pass a number here, the number of milliseconds it should simply take. I'll also come to more advanced use cases where we can also have some in-between styles during the animation. Well, before coming to so advanced topics, let me also copy it. And let's change the timing so that we can see a difference for the other way around. So highlighted to normal, like this. And if we now save this, we see that now it moves and it moves slower back. And this is now our first animation using the Angular 2 animation framework or helpers here, with that trigger the different states and then the transitions between these states. Now let's dive a little bit deeper at this and see how we can fine-tune this to our needs in the next videos. Well, the first thing you can do, and for that I'm animating this, or excuse me, I'm commenting this out. If you wanted to use the same timing, you don't have to duplicate this and simply write highlighted to normal here. Instead, you can use one line and simply make an arrow point in both directions. Now this means back and forth, use the same animate function. So in this case, use the 300 milliseconds, which now means we have the same timing. That's one thing. But also you might have a more complex animation where you want to control the styling this has during the movement. So not the beginning and not the end state, only during the transition. You might have some extra styles at this place or at this point of time too. Well, to simulate this, let me copy this trigger here so that we keep the simple one too. And I will name it wild state because it's getting more wild now. So the while state should now be applied to a new div I'm copying here too, which is now bound to that new while state. It still uses my state property, don't get me wrong, but here it now uses the while state. Now with that, I'm binding it to the while state animation trigger. I also want to set up a new property. I'll name it while state. And therefore here in my component, I'll duplicate normal and set this to while state so that I have two different divs where we can see two different things. Now, how does while state work, or how do I want to control this? Well, I still want to have my normal and my highlighted style, and I will leave the styling I have here. But I want to set up a third state. This is the shrunken state, let's say. So I'm able to shrink this square. The background color, let's say, should then be green, and we transform it such that we want to translate it 100 pixels, but we want to scale it to 0.5, let's say. And no, let's actually translate it 0 pixels, so at the starting point. Therefore, in the other two states, we want to scale it to 1. So that's again normal CSS setup here. And with that, we set up the different states. Now, I want to go back to where the two directions, highlighted to normal and normal to highlighted, have different durations, like we had it before. So like this. Yeah, I could have just commented this out. Anyways. Now, I also want to adjust this and also hook up this onShrink method here, this shrink button. So onShrink shall now assign this while state to be shrunken. That is that third state I set up here, shrunken. In onAnimate, I therefore also want to set this while state equal to, or first compare it if it's equal to normal, and if not, well, I basically want to do the same as here. So let me quickly copy this and replace this. So here I'm not using the shrunken state, that's something I'm only setting here. Now with this setup, I can of course reload my application. And once it does reload, we should see a new square below the first one. And maybe let's introduce a little divider here, like a line break, so that we can clearly see the difference. And now if I click animate, they both move with different speeds, of course, because I changed this. But shrinking still happens instantly. So shrinking is not really animated, and that is something I want to change. So back in the app component, we basically need a third transition because we're only targeting normal and highlighted, and we're not using shrunken now. To do that, I can use the following transition where I transition from and to shrunken and now from anywhere. So I don't care if I have normal or highlighted. No matter which of the both states it is, I want to play the same animation. And for that I can use the wildcard character, which means any state. So shrunken to any state and shrunken from any state should play the same animation here. For now, I'll animate it over 500 milliseconds so that we can see something before I then fine-tune this. So after reloading this, if I now shrink it, you see it shrink down, and if I animate, you now see it switch and animate correctly. So now we are animating this, and the wildcard character here is the key to give us the flexibility that we don't manually have to specify any possible state, and in your application where you maybe derive the state dynamically, you might really not know which states it could have, and there the wildcard character is what you need. Now in the next video I want to dive in how to manipulate this animate function and have some in-between styles during the animation. Thus far, we only had starting and ending state. Now let's play around with the animate function. We actually can not only pass the timing, we can control the whole animation and define styles the animation should take during the animation. For that, I will pass a second argument here, which is the style method again. We're already importing that. And as I can define the style in a state, I can also define a style during the animation. So here I also pass a JavaScript object, and that in-between style will now be taken during the installation. So here, Let's say I want to give this a border radius of 50 pixels. Now let's see how that looks. If I save this with this extra style during the animation, if I hit shrink, you see it now looks kind of ugly because now we let these border radius, or we let it, well, get round, but once it finishes, it instantly jumps to the end state. So this is not really what we want. We want to smoothly have this in between our animation and not animate the changing of the border radius and then instantly jump to the end state. To cater for such needs, we would replace this animate function here, like this, with an array. Now we can pass an array as the second argument to transition, and here we can also define starting and in-between states during this transition. So we could pass a style here and say background color shall be orange. That would be one thing. Thereafter, the second element in this array would be an animate function, which takes, let's say, 1 second, where I want to animate my border radius as before, border radius, 50 pixels. And now to avoid this ugly jump at the end, I add another animate function of half a second, which will be executed after the border radius has been changed. Now with that, we should instantly see a change to the background color to orange. Thereafter, we should see the border radius developing over 1 second, and thereafter we should see the animation of, well, half a second, where we remove the border radius again, shrink the object, and turn it from orange back to our end state, which is green, for example, if we do shrink it. Well, let's see this. If I shrink it, we do indeed see it turn orange, see the border radius, and thereafter see it shrink and the border radius being removed. And the same is true if I animate back. So with that, I got a more complex animation where I chain multiple styles. And while all this nesting here might look difficult, it actually isn't. It only is an array passed to the transition, which allows us to define different phases in that transition. Starting phase, if no animate method is used, then it is instantly applied. Then if we do add animate, we do apply a style but over some time. And if we have animate without a style, this means basically now transition to the end state. And this is how we can set up our animation. Of course, we could have multiple in-between styles. The important thing is that you do end with animate 500 or whatever timing you have to get smoothly to the end state. Otherwise, you will see what we had before, that it instantly snaps back to your end state. Probably not what you want. This is a more complex transition with the in-between steps, but I think still manageable if you really think about what's happening here with these different phases.